My name is Angus Collins O'Malley. I'm a son of Mary Claire Collins Paul, who was a grandniece of Michael Collins. Her granny was Mary Collins Paul, who was a sister of Michael Collins, and my granddad was Sean Collins Paul, who was 17 when Michael Collins died, and he was actually very close to him. Sean Collins Paul was he was one of his oldest nephews.
People understand just how complex an individual this man was. He started out his complexity actually when he was very, very young. His father was 60 years old when he was married, and Collins didn't really exactly know his father real well. He was only 6 years old when his father died.
My grandmother, Mary Collins, was born in 1882.
Sure.
And Mary recalls that she and her older sister, Hannah, born in 1879, were often in charge of baby Michael, and Hannah used to say that Michael was born for their edification. One day, while they were playing in the kitchen loft, Michael suddenly disappeared. He'd fallen through a trapdoor with a typical Michael Collins luck. He fortunately had a soft landing. Mary tells a story about the infant Michael. All had gone to the local fair and I was in charge. I'd forgotten to get potatoes for dinner. I went outside to the garden to get potatoes, and there I found 4-year-old Michael, who had managed to dig a large bucketful. He was 4.5 when he came under the patriotic influence of Dennis Lyons, the headmaster of Lissavard National School. Dennis was an IRB man.
His schoolteacher, Dennis Lyons, wrote the following report on Michael Collins when he was 10 years old. you can see how he was developing. Exceptionally intelligent at observation and at figures. Character good, able and willing to adjust himself to all circumstances. Displays more than a normal interest in things appertaining to the welfare of his country.
I think many things influenced as a child. I mean, I think he was very influenced by his school teacher, Dennis Lyons. He was very influenced by he was the youngest child, remember? And also he was dominated, a family that was dominated by sisters.
Michael Collins's grandmother would have told him about the dead bodies which could be seen on the roads as a result of the famine around Clonakilty. Well over 1 million Irish people would have starved under English patronage. He could also see the effects of evictions by the exploitation of the land by English landlords.
Oh, Father dear, I often hear you speak of Erin's oil. Her lofty scene of valleys green, the mountains are rude and wild. They say it is a lovely land wherein a prince might dwell. So why did you abandon her? The reason to me tell. Son, I love my native land with energy and pride. The blight came all on me crops, on me sheep and me cattle died. Her rents and taxes were too high, I could not them redeem. That's another reason why I left old Skibbereen.
And I really want people to understand that from the very beginning, through his father's own Fenian roots and James Santry's and Dennis Lyons, Collins started out with a love of Irish history and a love of the idea of being separate from England.
The family was very academic, you know. Michael learned Greek and Latin in school, and when he was a teenager he did the post office exams. So what influenced the family, I think, was getting ahead, getting themselves educated. And getting ahead, and his sisters had a massive influence on him. I mean, I remember speaking to my granddad about him. My granddad I asked him what made him so great, why did he achieve so much, and my granddad said it was his work rate. Very often he used to stay up till 2 o'clock in the morning doing his admin work, writing letters.
He was a very complex character who had the knack of making himself all things to all men, and of leaving people with the view of him that he wanted them to have. And you mentioned that again, that people just picked what they wanted of, and I think that's part of his legacy. Not that he fooled them, he wasn't a kind of a devious type, but a very discerning type. So he left you with the impression you wanted.
You wanted, exactly, yeah.
And that's what we have here in Ireland today, a history which it depends on who you're talking to.
Everything about Collins is complex, controversial, and contradictory. Even the nickname, the big fella, we want to start there. The fact of the matter is, his family called him that because he was the youngest child, and they thought he very often took on tasks that were beyond his years. But then when he got to Frog Up, he got it for a different reason. Some of the people said that they thought he was too big for his britches, and in fact, he thinks he's a big fella. So what we have is a conflict all the way through with Collins and how people viewed him.
In February 1906, Michael sat the exam for temporary boy clerks at the University College of Cork. He obtained good results and left West Cork to join his sister Hanny in London.
Of course, when he went to London when he was 15 years old, he still met the people in London who were very much involved in Irish history and Irish separatism, Sam Maguire, those individuals, and they were there for the rest of his life.
Well, he stayed in 5 Netherwood Gardens, and he stayed with his sister Hanny.
Sure.
And he, as you know, he was friendly with Sam Maguire.
Yeah.
And Hanny took him into the homes of our English friends, who became his friends. Example, of course, are the Laverys She saw to it that Michael Collins at least understood the English way of life. I think that gave him a plus point at the treaty debates. He was able, and his ability to get on with Churchill. He knew their psyche. He understood them.
Because he was well read
And he saw it from their point of view too. Yeah, he knew who he was up against.
So could you tell me how he got involved with the IRB?
I mean, obviously the IRB being a secretive organisation, he was sworn in by his neighbour from West Cork, Sam Maguire, who went on to be a very, very significant friend of Michael's and a very crucial cog in the struggle for independence.
Sam also worked in the post office. Michael had great time for Sam Maguire, whose name is immortalised on the All-Ireland football trophy, even though he's not remembered very well. Michael would frequently challenge him to wrestling bouts and would playfully call him you bloody South of Ireland Protestant. At this time, he also befriended Joe O'Reilly. His mother, Mary Ann, known for strength of character, her many kindnesses, and the characteristic Collins' religious tolerance. Her Protestant neighbours laid her out when she died in 1907.
And basically what it went from that point on is he joined the Geraldines. He was involved with GAA. He was involved to a lesser degree with the Gaelic League, but a little bit. But he was also involved when just doing the kind of things that a young single male in London would have been doing at that time.
He joined the London GAA and through this the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood. The GAA was a good recruiting ground for the IRB in London, which was a secret organisation for the establishment of an independent democratic republic in Ireland. In 1909 he was sworn into the IRB at this location, the Aria, at Barnsbury Hall on Barnsbury Street. The IRB had extremely modern notions of democracy, answerable to all the people, not an elite only from the right background in school. P.S. O'Hegarty wrote of Michael Collins' life and times in London. There was very little of the Mick Collins of those days to give promise of the man who was to come. He was always on the right side of the many battles on the many platforms on which Sinn Féin fought. He was well read in modern literature and drama and keen to talk about them.
He also joined the GAA club, the Geraldines, and he became the secretary at 17 years of age and held that position until he left London in January 1916.
Sure.
The following incident gives a flavour of the strident and pragmatic side of his personality. His first yearly report to the club was a trenchant one, I quote. He's quoting this to the meeting. Our internal affairs were saddening, but our efforts in football and hurling were perfectly heartbreaking. In conclusion, I can only say that our records for the past year leaves no scope for self-congratulation. Signs of decay are unmistakable, and if members are not prepared in future to act harmoniously together and more sacrificingly generally, the club will soon have faded into an inglorious, well-deserved oblivion. He left the savings bank in 1910, and albeit he passed the exams for a higher grade in the civil service, he took the position with stockbrokers Horner and Company, where he obtained good financial experience. In 1914, he moved to Guarantee Trust Company. It was in New York, and he thought that was a good move, in Lombard Street, London, where he remained until the end of 1915.
He developed accuracy and attention to detail due to his administrative training.
While he was still in London, a young man there, he joined the IRB, as you all know, and he wrote this. He said, with the decline of the pro-IRB movement, so did ours come into prominence. But by comparison, this revitalized IRB is vastly different in, for example, organization. Organization, a lack of it, was responsible for the failure of previous risings. He was under 25 years old. He was not known anywhere. He was not an officer in the IRB. He wasn't a center. He was just a young man whose ideas were starting to come to the fore. But even then, he thought in the very way that he did later on.
In London, he read about Thomas Davis and John Mitchell. Irish freedom was continually playing on his mind. He also studied Boer War guerrilla tactics which were employed by the Boers against the British in South Africa. In 1914, World War I broke out. Collins knew this was not Ireland's war, it was a war of empires. He had written a letter in early January 1915 stating that this unhappy position in which I find myself not wanting to be part of an army, in which in the past and now has pledged itself to the oppression of Ireland, yet not wanting at the same time to seek the murky honour of being a conscientious objector. America would seem to be the best solution. When asked later in his life if a German victory for Ireland would have been better than the Allied victory, he responded that our aim was to win our freedom. We believed that the worse England's plight was, the better was our chance to compel her to grant our demand. We were not pro-German during the war, any more than we were pro-Bulgarian, pro-Turk, or anti-French. We were anti-British, pursuing our age-long policy against a common enemy. We were a weak nation kept in subjection by a stronger one, and we formed and adopted this policy in light of this fact. In 1914, Michael had an opportunity that many Irish people took, a chance to go to America. Michael said it was in 1914, just before the declaration of war, that the chance came to take passage to New York. I could have gone under the most advantageous conditions and with the one thing I had been looking for, a fair chance to get ahead. But when I laid the scheme before Tom Clark, the Thomas J. Clark of the Easter week, he advised me not to go. His reason satisfied me. He said, there was going to be something doing in Ireland within a year. That was good enough for me. I'd changed my mind about going to America and plodded along in my uncongenial job. Joe Good witness statement 388 on his time in London. I enlisted in the volunteers at a place called the German Gymnasium near King's Cross, London, sometime early 1914. When I joined, the only person I saw that I knew really well was Michael Collins. He was with me the first night I joined up, and the following week he was a section leader. My first impression of Michael Collins as a man was that he recognised ability in a rival, and I had no doubt as to his competence to lead. Obviously this man, Michael Collins, meant to be in command. I had, and he knew it, military training, and he rather ridiculed my methods of drilling, although he knew his own lack of knowledge in that matter at the time. Before the summer of 1915 ended, Collins was summoned and travelled to Dublin. 15 of his pals also made the journey. 6 of these pals were killed in Easter week of 1916. Before the Rising, Collins was appointed as financial advisor to Count Plunkett, father of Joseph Mary Plunkett, one of the 1916 leaders. Josie disliked Kimmage.
He was pretty much disliked in Kimmage. He had come to Dublin in 1914. He had come to Dublin in 1915. He had talked to Sean McDermott. He had talked to Thomas Clark. He thought, I've got to get out of London because they are going to institute conscription in England, and when they do that, I don't want to do that. He had talked to his own brother, Collins' own brother, in Chicago, and was thinking about going to the United States. And Clark and McDermott told him, no, we're going to have something going on here in a little while.
The Conscription Act came into force on the 16th of January, and Michael left 5 Netherwood Road, London, the previous night, the 15th of January. Michael, like other IRB men, had received a summons from Sean McDermott, the Easter 1916 leader, to return to Dublin, Michael received his release from employment by telling his his manager that he wished to go to Dublin to join the Irish regiment.
Right.
I suppose you can appreciate the irony of that.
Absolutely, yeah.
His manager congratulated him, allowed him to leave immediately, paying him an extra month's salary to enable him to take a holiday. Michael exchanged his cheque for gold at the Bank of England, and on arrival in Dublin he handed the gold to Sean McDermott, who was laying aside a gold reserve.
I believe he told his employer he was joining an army in 1960, gone back to Dublin to join the army, and his employer thought he was signing up to fight in World War One.
Collins was a very vain man, and when he came over, for example, he was working, but he was able to buy a uniform. And most of the people there didn't have uniforms. The people, if you see the pictures in the Rising, maybe they had a bandolier, maybe they had an armband. Very few people actually had a uniform, and Collins did. So a great many of the people, Joe Good wrote quite extensively about the fact that Collins was not well liked. He was not the kind of a person that they thought was very good. He worked for Joe Plunkett. He came out there every day. He was kind of given one of his things was to report to the IRB with regard to Kimmage, but he was not very well liked.
Joe Good, in his witness statement, recounts visiting Dublin in 1916. Mick Collins ordered me to go to Larkfield Kimmage, headquarters of the 4th Battalion, where there was a miniature range. 30 or 40 men, mainly from Liverpool, occupied a derelict mill, part of property belonging to Ken Plunkett. We were disciplined troops under George Plunkett, drilling and making ammunition. We had 2 crude brass moulds, turning out 10 lead pellets each. Owing to the metal being run so hot, the mould became heated. The pellets were therefore apt to have a ragged fringe of lead. These fringes we most carefully trimmed off, lest it should be said that we fired dum-dums. Joe Good, a member of the London Irish Who Mobilised, has said, Mick was a bad junior officer, respected but not loved by the Kimmage garrison. They could see through some of the tricks he had learned abroad. Speaking of Collins at this time, O'Connor said of Collins, there was no one at Kimmage to equal him. They would be on opposing sides a few years later. 2 figures Collins would not have time to establish a lasting relationship with, but that he admired greatly, was Tom Clarke and Sean McDermott. Both men were executed for their part. England was embroiled in World War I, but the volunteers adopted the phrase used before that, England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. An Irish uprising was timed to coincide with the landing of German arms off the coast of Kerry.
He wrote to his sister Annie, I'm still in Dublin doing a little bit, a very little bit, working 3 days a week as financial advisor to Count Plunkett. My present job is at Kimmage, far out. Mary Joseph Plunkett recognised the potential revolutionary and took in his spiels about spies inter alia. He gave Michael Chesterton's book to read, The Man Who Was Thursday. If you didn't seem to be hiding, nobody hunted you out. So that's why he went around in this cavalier way and on the bike as an ordinary citizen. People perceived him as an ordinary citizen.
After the 1916 Rising, Collins acted on that advice with spectacular results, often cycling through streets, delivering messages in broad daylight on a bicycle in the heart of Dublin when there was a price on his head. Plunkett was appointed Director of Military Operations in 1916, and Collins was to look after him throughout much of the week as Plunkett was slowly dying from tuberculosis. Collins trusted Nancy O'Brien because he and Sean McDermott, in a Dublin cafe, discussed the possibilities of the forthcoming rising with her. Owen McNeill's countermanding order was to have a catastrophic effect on who mobilised on Easter week, especially outside of Dublin. Sorcha McDermott, Witness Statement 945, Secretary of the London branch of Cumann na mBan. Sheila Connolly, I think she was from Skibbereen and she is now a John of God nun in Wexford, came over from London for her Easter holidays. Michael Collins sent her back to London to tell the volunteers that the rising was taking place after all. They had been informed previously that it was all off. That is why those I have mentioned came over on the Saturday. It happened that Michael Collins's right thumb was injured and Sheila banished it for him. Therefore, he was not able to use a weapon during the rising. In the Metropole Hotel, Plunkett was recovering from a throat operation. He warned Collins and Commandant Brennan Whitmore that they could be stopped on their way out of the hotel by a small dark-haired man. He gave Collins the key to a trunk in which there were 3 automatics in case this should happen. At the foot of the stairs, the man was waiting. The hotel lobby was packed with British officers getting ready to go to Ferryhouse races. The pocketed automatics were gripped tightly. In the event, the dark-haired man saluted, "Good day to you, gentlemen." These are the various outposts in the 1916 rising. You can see Collins stationed here at the GPO. De Valera, future President of Ireland, is stationed in Boland's Mill. De Valera was a great strategist, but during the week of the rising in 1916, events took their toll on him. When Lieutenant Fitzgerald tried to make De Valera sleep, he was quoted as saying, "I can't trust the men. They'll leave their posts or fall asleep if I don't watch them." De Valera's path and Collins were to interweave throughout the next 6 years.
He was Plunkett's aide-de-camp in 1916. He was in the GPO.
As soon as Collins entered the GPO, he made a mark for himself by pouring 2 tierces of stout down the drain. He also trussed up an English officer and reassured them that we don't shoot prisoners. Most of his duties lay in the operations room where the leaders laid out maps and plans. He was guarding the stairwell in the GPO up to the roof.
Collins did not have a great role in 1916. He had absolutely no role in the planning of it or anything like that. But strangely enough, in 1916, he started showing his abilities that would come up later. He was one of the ones who went around and said, "We need the names of everybody here who was in the GPO." We started writing those down in case somebody was killed or hurt, and he thought that this is the only way we do this. He was the one who said, "We have to do some organizing here, and we'll make sure that everybody's recognized." He was the one who went and took whenever they brought provisions in, if there was any alcohol in it, he would pour it out. So he started, even then in 1916, while he didn't have a big role, and while he had no role in the planning of it, he started showing his organizational and his administrative abilities.
Desmond Fitzgerald, father of the former Taoiseach Gareth Fitzgerald, who was also active Easter week, would later become Collins' chief of propaganda, described him as the most active and efficient officer in the place. Collins had also sorted out a row between the London Irish and Fitzgerald. Desmond Fitzgerald was in charge of the food and gives the following account. Michael Collins strode in one morning with some of his men who were covered with dust and had been demolishing walls and building barricades, and announced that these men were to be fed if it took the last food in the place. I did not attempt to argue with him, and the men sat down openly rejoicing that I had been crushed. Collins's spirit and sense of humour held up for most of the week. In Tim Pat Coogan's biography of Michael Collins, that during the week after a furious round of shots were fired, Collins and Gearóid O'Sullivan went up to Pearse to ask him if he would mind if they popped out for a bit, as they had a date with 2 girls they didn't like disappointing. The British boat, the Helga, had moved slowly down the River Liffey with its deadly cargo. The GPO went on fire. It spread to the first floor. Mick Collins was trying to put it out with a hose pipe, but there was a pure water supply, and in his attempt to put out the fire, his breeches were burned. Sniper fire, machine guns and 9-pounder guns from Trinity College and the 18-pounder shells from the Helga forced the insurgents reluctantly to abandon the GPO. Michael Collins helped to form a barricade across a small laneway opposite the White House, down which apparently the military were firing. During this time in Mirror Street, Michael Collins was very aggressive and ill-humoured. When the men looked for his approval, he said, "So-and-so your barricade." I was resting on the stairs at one period with my head in my hands, and Mick said angrily to me, "Are you praying too?" Frank de Burker witness statement 694 on the evacuation into Mirror Street. We broke in the door and found ourselves in a stone beer store. We went upstairs and proceeded to barricade the windows on the instructions of a fine young captain in full uniform. This was our first meeting with the famous Mick Collins. I don't think he was pleased with the way we had barricaded the windows, but we could do no better as we had not the material at hand. We were practically exhausted by this time from lack of food and sleep. The board through the houses in Mirror Street. Collins had bravely led his men across, shouting encouragement. Just as he had begun the rising by pouring away a porter, he ended it drinking whiskey with two others. Fionn Lynch, who would later serve in an Irish government with Collins, and a young doctor from Wexford, Jim Ryan, who had acted as medical officer to the volunteers in the GPO, would surrender. They were sealed off from troops in other areas. Also, one of Collins' boyhood friends, Sean Hurley, had been killed. Collins was upset and wrote about the death of his friend Sean Hurley. He has the sharpness of mind to see my own particular mood. We think the same way in Irish matters. We have walked London streets on many a night silently because our thinking was elsewhere. At worst, he is a boon companion. At best, there is no one else I would have as a friend. The London Irish refused to surrender so that they would not be conscripted and probably killed for England, preferring to fight to the end in Dublin. Collins could not change their minds to surrender, so he went to McDermott. For the last time, he showed his capacity for leadership. McDermott said, "We'll die, you'll escape. No one will try to conscript you." Pierce decided to surrender with the others after seeing civilians murdered in cold blood on the street. There were other civilian atrocities carried out nearby by the 26th South Staffordshire Regiment, who had murdered 16 civilians who had nothing to do with the rebellion on North King Street. The volunteers were made to lie on the grass overnight until morning at the Rotunda Hospital. They would have to relieve themselves where they lay. At the Rotunda Gardens, Captain Leah Wilson ill-treated Collins when he found him trying to slip some malted milk tablets to a comrade. Leah Wilson had pranced around demanding of his soldiers, "Who do you consider the worst, the Boche or the Sinn Féiners?" Naturally, they all responded that we were the worst. Liam Tobin recalls how he got cramp in his leg but was refused permission to stand up, and that they had to suffer the indignity of relieving themselves lying on the grass beside their comrades. Captain Leah Wilson wanted to make a show of some of the Irish prisoners. He stripped Tom Clark naked in front of the prisoners and nurses. Clark had suffered a great deal from a wound in his elbow earlier in the year. As Lee Wilson ripped off his jacket, the wound opened. Liam Tobin and Michael Collins had looked up and vowed he would deal with him in the future. Wilson was shot dead a few years later thanks to Collins's intelligence network.
It's bad enough after a revolution to have Tom Clark lying in the open, kept alive by Michael Collins, wrapping his arms around him at the back of the rotunda.
Tobin writes, "I looked up at him and I vowed that I would deal with him sometime in the future." He did. Daniel Hoey, a G Division man who had spotted Sean McDermott when going through the prisoners, was also killed years later. Immediately after the execution of the 1916 leaders, George Bernard Shaw wrote an open letter to the Daily Mail. The men shot in cold blood after their capture or surrender were prisoners of war. Collins has said of the men who took part in the Easter Rising of 1916 that, "As for heroism, I saw many instances. All of our men were full of pluck and daring. Only that breed of men would have engaged in a contest where the odds were worse than 10 to 1 against." He also admits in a less propagandist fashion, "Although I was never actually scared in the GPO, I was, and others too, witless enough to do the most stupid things. Collins has also said in regard to 1916, that valiant effort and the martyrdoms that followed 1916 finally awoke the sleeping spirit of Ireland. Collins has also said in a letter to Kevin O'Brien, on the whole, I think the rising was bungled terribly, costing many a good life. It seemed at first to be well organised, but afterwards became subjected to panic decisions and a great lack of very essential organisation and cooperation. After the surrender, we were marched into the gymnasium in Richmond Barracks. Joe Good described an altercation Michael Collins had with a British soldier after the surrender of Easter Week 1916. He says, I was sharing Michael Collins' overcoat. The floor was hard. A British soldier said to Michael Collins, what has you here, Collins? And Mick replied, England's difficulty. There was a long pause then. In Richmond Barracks, prisoners were being processed. Collins was one of those selected by the G-men to be severely dealt with. He heard his name called from the further end of the building. He couldn't see who was calling him and risked the walk across the room. He stayed with the other batch of prisoners. This decision saved him from severe treatment.
There was a man named Joe Cavanaugh, and after the rising, he was in Richmond Barracks, and instead of identifying the volunteers who were up there, he would walk behind them and whisper to them, do you have any documents on you that you want me to take?
Captured rebels were being sent to jails on mainland Britain. Nancy O'Brien, having caught up with prisoners being marched to prison, asked Michael, what will you do now? His reply was, do? Sure, I'll get ready for the next round, of course. I got some of the names taken down already. The best of men. Nancy was flabbergasted. How are you going to train them? Collins mocked. Sure, won't His Majesty's government train them for me? Many were sent to Frongoch and Wales. Collins began hatching plans for the next time, even before the prison ships left Dublin.
And it was really in Frongoch that he came, after 1916, that he came into his own. I think they had an Olympics in Frongoch, and he won the long jump and he won the 100-metre sprint. Yeah,
right, okay.
Yeah, and he was involved in all the sports,
okay.
And that's where he built his network. The University of Revolution.
Okay.
That was Frongoch.
He was very physical though, he liked wrestling. And
we did, yeah, biting ears.
Yeah. On the 16th of May, Collins wrote to Hanny, you've no idea what it is like, the dreadful monotony, the heart-scalding eternal brooding on all sorts of things, thoughts of friends dead and living, especially those recently dead, but above all the time, the horror of the way in which it refuses to pass. It is only with the utmost effort that I can concentrate my thoughts or be at all rational. I seem to have lost acquaintance with myself and with the people I knew. Wilde's Reading Jail, you remember. All that you know will be in jail. A letter to Siobhan or Susan Killeen. See you again before the resurrection. He also talks about Frongoch. Prating about home, friends and so on doesn't alter the fact that this is Frongoch, an internment camp. There's only one thing to do while the situation is as it is. Make what I can of it. Having scored victory in the 100 yards during the camp sports on the 8th of August, he passed out M.W. O'Reilly, Riley commenting, you hure, you can't run. The runner-up was his friend Sean Hales, the Munster champion in the 56-pound weight-throwing competition. Collins' competitive nature has been described. He would fight with a friendly determination. If he were closely matched, then the contest would end in a heated and often bloody mess. Robert J. Roberts, a 16-year-old canteen assistant at Frongoch, wrote later, I came in contact with Michael Collins, coming into the canteen covered in mud with the crowd, and we objected and told him to wash their boots at the water taps outside. He just laughed. He had a great sense of humour but was a very stern disciplinarian. When I returned to the counter, there were only very few pipes in the box, and no payments for other goods missing. I reported what was going on and we complained to the senior prisoner, who was Michael Collins. He arranged to assist us by locking the canteen door and searching each prisoner. If a prisoner had one pipe or box of matches, he was given the benefit of the doubt. Otherwise, stolen goods were returned. Collins must have told his mother about me, because she sent me a small present of a tie pin in the pattern of the shamrock inlaid with green Connemara stone for my kindness to her son. He was very highly respected, especially by the civilian canteen staff. However, Collins's mother had died 9 years previously. He used her name to show Roberts how much he thought of him. The Irish word for rat was frangach. Frangach was infested with rodents. Collins wrote to Susan, "Had a most exciting experience myself the other night. Woke up to find a rat between my blankets. Didn't catch the blighter either."
He asks for some of Hardy's books when he was in Frangach. I happen to have, or I still have, a cross-section of Hardy's books, which include Scott, Dickens, Arnold Bennett, Tennyson, Hardy, Eliot, Conrad, Yeats and Shaw. He copied extracts from Shaw's The Man of Destiny to carry around in his wallet. I bought Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, and we've given that to the Carl archives.
Eamon Dora witness statement 153. Collins was an avid reader, loved G.K. Chesterton's Napoleon of Notting Hill. He heard too many first-hand impressions and reports of the Rising and its aftermath to be able to accept objectively what happened, or be left unaffected. His own leader, Joseph Plunkett, had married Grace Gifford on the morning of his execution. 15 soldiers with fixed bayonets lined the cell. An officer counted out the seconds of the 10 minutes the bride and groom were given before the groom was taken out to be executed. He heard how James Connolly, in terrible pain, had to be given morphine to make him sleep, then was woken up to be told he was to be executed at dawn. Writing to Kevin O'Brien, he declared, "I want to be quite fair about this. The Easter Rising, and say how much I admired the men in the ranks and the women folk thus engaged. But at the same time, as it must appear to others also, the actions of the leaders should not pass without comment. They have died nobly at the hands of the firing squads, so much I grant. But I do not think the Rising Week was an appropriate time for the issue of memoranda couched in poetic phrases, nor of actions worked out in a similar fashion. Of Pearse and Connolly, I admired the latter the most. Connolly was a realist, Pearse the direct opposite. There was an air of earthly directness about Connolly. It impressed me. I would have followed him through hell had such action been necessary. But I honestly doubt very much if I would have followed Pearse. Not without some thought, anyway. I think chiefly of Tom Clarke and McDermott. Both built on the best foundations. Ireland will not see another Sean McDermott. These are sharp reflections. On the whole, I think the Rising was bungled terribly, costing many a good life. It seemed at first to be well organised, but afterwards became subjected to panic decisions and a great lack of very essential organisation and cooperation. One of the executed leaders, Major John McBride, who had fought for the Boers in South Africa, had addressed his men just before the surrender. He advised them never to allow themselves to be locked up in buildings when confronting an enemy who could easily subdue them with the aid of superior man and firepower. Collins was to become the supreme creator of the hit-and-run ambush technique, which effectively confronted this superiority. In Lewis Prison, De Valera was beginning to make a name for himself as the prisoners' leader. By June 1916, Kathleen had sent out the first post-Rising communiqué saying that this was only the beginning. Collins helped begin in Frangach the formation of what later became one of Ireland's largest insurance businesses, the New Ireland Assurance Company. It was designed to keep in Irish hands a portion of the large amount of money being sent out of the country to English insurers. It also provided a useful cover later on for IRB activities. In Frangach, the prisoners feared that they would be conscripted, and to avoid this they gave false names and confused the authorities in any way they could. Collins led this form of defiance. Brennan Whitmore told a comrade how, as a result of the authorities' black propaganda that the prisoners were rich with German gold, a guard had inquired whether he was one of the boys with all the money. Brennan Whitmore was brought before an IRB meeting as a result. Collins demanded to be told everything Whitmore could about the soldier. A short time later, the guard was used to smuggle letters and information out of the camp. They fought for prisoner of war status. Collins rejected all suggestions of compromise or moderation. He wrote, "Sit down, refuse to budge. You have the British beaten. For a time they'll raise war, in the end they'll despair. Method, but unorthodox, has them beaten the whole time. 200 of the prisoners went on a 3-day hunger strike on the 2nd of November, and the prison commandant, Colonel Haygate Lambert, declared that he would have discipline in the camp even though it was filled with nothing but dead bodies. The 2 camp doctors followed instructions in not attending to patients who refused to give their names, but one of them, Dr. Peters, worried by statements concerning the treatment of prisoners, broke under the strain and drowned himself in the river Thrywern near Bala. Colonel F.A. Haygate Lambert, the camp commandant, earned the nickname Buckshot and was disliked by the Irish prisoners. Michael Collins commented, "It's hard to imagine anything in the shape of a man being more like a tyrannical old woman than the commandant in charge of this place."
The treatment that he got, and it actually says the beatings that the volunteers got, and there's about 8 or 9 volunteers mentioned in this statement, and it's from all the surgeons who visited the prisons and the camps at the time, what they went through, what they seen, the beatings that they got, the ill treatment that they got by the other soldiers in the camp. That it would turn you, it would make you sick. The conditions, the dampness of the billets. A lot of the volunteers died young in their 40s and in their late 30s from TB and from bad lung diseases and that, just from the weather that they were in and the billets that they were in.
House of Commons debate. Mr. Byrne asked the Home Secretary if he has received a letter from the Irish prisoners interned at Frongach camp demanding a sworn inquiry into the statement of the Commandant in reference to the cause of death of the camp doctor, and if he will grant the inquiry. Sir G. Cave replied, "I have received such a letter, but have postponed my decision as to an inquiry until I receive a full note of the evidence at the inquest."
Joe Sweeney has said of Collins' time in Frongach that Collins got really busy there. He got quite a number of his own people from West Cork. We used to call them the Mafia. They ran the whole camp. He saw that everybody in charge of the huts was an IRB man. The people in pivotal positions were IRB. He organised classes of all kinds, both educational and military. And he saw to it that more attention was paid to guerrilla fighting. And we had fellows in there from all parts of Ireland in Frongach, and he built up a great system of contacts there in that way. It was then to that he began to get information about friendly police, those who had done good acts for lads after 1916 in various parts of the country. And he'd followed those all up. Invariably, he recruited those men.
It was Rattenfest in Frongach. I mean, it was a University Revolution. It was a horrid place.
Yeah, of course it was. And they sung the German national anthem on the
right,
platform.
yeah.
Well, I think when they were immediately released from Frongach, they were, was it in Crewe Station, they were getting the train, and it was just before Christmas, so they were in high spirits, and they immediately burst into a rendition of the German national anthem. And then they were the train, and they set sail and were all picked up in Dublin.
Okay.
Yeah. Had a bit of a party and taken home to Cork.
In the Gaelic League, he mixed with men who were to become his closest supporters and harshest foes. Richard Mulcahy, Gearóid O'Sullivan, Cathal Brua and Rory O'Connor.
But Kathleen Clarke was obviously linked with 16. She wasn't merely the widow of Tom Clarke. She was a terribly important person, and it should be brought out more. And there was need for prisoners' aid and prisoners' dependence funds. It came, of course, from America, like Joe McGarrity and John Devoy in particular. And John Devoy regarded Kathleen Clarke rightly as the symbol in 1916. Would have known her in America probably, and she was a very businesslike woman, practical woman, very honourable. So the money was sent to her, and she ran for a time. And then when the prisoners were released from Frongach, it showed that she knew what she was doing. She knew who the right people were. even though they were in jail, she was keeping an eye on who was who. And when they came out, she handed on the torch in 1916 to the young Cork man, Michael Collins, who was unknown at the time.
Before his death in 1916, Tom Clark had designated his wife Kathleen Clark to be in charge of official IRB business.
She was literally the link between the Fenian time of her husband and the newer ones of the Michael Collins stamp.
When Michael arrived back in Dublin in early 1917, it was very different from a year earlier. He was now well known, found lodgings at 44 Mountjoy Street. On the 19th of February 1917, he became secretary to the National Aid and the Volunteers Dependent Fund at 10 Exchequer Street.
10 Exchequer Street and then 32 Bachelor's Walk were the offices of the Volunteer Dependent Funds. And those are the first places where Collins worked when he came back here. He went to work for Kathleen Clark. But after the men started coming back from Frongog, they would use their offices as their meeting point.
Soon after Michael Collins' release from prison, Kathleen appointed him secretary to the National Aid and Volunteers Dependence Fund and subsequently passed on organisation information and contacts to help him build up the independence movement.
He came back and Kathleen Clark had already started the Volunteers Dependence Fund. And when he came back at the end of 1916, it was already started. And actually Collins went and interviewed for the job. And when he did, he walked in and he sat on the edge of the desk with his legs swinging, and some of the ladies there didn't like him. They thought, again, he was very arrogant, that this wasn't it. But the people from Frongog were there, and when it was going to be a determination as to who they're going to pick, they had gone around and said, "When we need somebody who knows all of us and knows what's going on." But Kathleen Clark's view was paramount, and they hired him. Of Collins, she said she was never ever sorry for hiring. I gave all the information to Mick, and that gave him the leeway to get ahead. He had the drive, the ability, the force, and the enthusiasm to do it, and he used it very, very well.
Mrs. Tom Clark interviewed him and was struck by his resemblance to Sean McDermott. I don't think there's that much of a resemblance.
He assisted in raising money. When they ran short, he would dip into his own pocket to help some of the down and outs, and he did it. And the primary persons who worked for the group were coming among. They were the women. They were the ones who went out and raised the funds generally, and they were the ones who dispersed the funds. But in doing so, they carried messages on their person, went out, and it was extraordinarily Collins. That's how he built his women's organization. He only worked there for a little over a year, and by the time he left, two things had happened. Number one, they had pretty much done all the work that they were going to do. The fund itself was kind of losing because the men had come back and they didn't need it. But also Collins was very, very involved in the other things he was doing. He was involved in intelligence and that sort of thing at the time, and he was doing less and less there. Actually, Collins was let go at the end of that period of time. Okay. He was given a month's salary and let go at the end. And that suited everybody just fine because the fund was going to stop at that point anyway.
This is number 5 Cabra Road in Dublin, and its householder, Michael Foley, introduced Michael Collins to the famous detective Eamon Broy. Eamon Broy was working in Dublin Castle. Eamon Broy was interviewed by Tim Pat Coogan as to why he wanted to get involved. He has stated, "The Fenians were riddled with informers. After 1916, I felt it was time we learned the lesson." Ned Broy told Collins, "The RIC will have to be dealt with. You'll have to shoot." Broy, since 1916, had been passing on information to Sinn Féin. The people who received it were the O'Hanrahan family, in particular Harry O'Hanrahan. Nothing seemed to come of his efforts, though. In April 1917, a loose cooperation of Arthur Griffith's moderate Sinn Féin, Labour, the Volunteers, and Count Plunkett's followers would campaign on abstaining from the British Parliament and appealing to the peace conference after World War I. McGuinness was selected against his will as Sinn Féin candidate for the Longford South by-election in May 1917 by Collins. Joe McGuinness was chosen because of his connections with Longford Town. McGuinness was still in Lewis jail along with De Valera. The prisoners in Lewis were opposed to standing a candidate when the Irish Parliamentary Party looked likely to win, so McGuinness declined to stand. However, Collins had him nominated anyway, and McGuinness went on to win by 37 votes after a recount. His election slogan was, "Put him in to get him out." On the day before the election, 21 Catholic and Protestant bishops signed a petition opposing partition. Archbishop Walsh went further. Eamon de Valera set out their objections in a long memorandum. The principal reason was the belief that if McGuinness lost, it would mean the ruin of the hopes, not to say the ideals, which prompted our comrades to give the word last Easter. His defeat would mean our defeat. The prisoners were overruled by Michael Collins, who appears to have been subjected to torrents of abuse from the remaining prisoners. One gets so used to being called bad names and being misunderstood, Collins has said. Thomas Ashe from Lewis Prison and Harry Boland were in favour of McGuinness going for election. The IRB understood that selecting candidates would enable them to influence future policy towards republicanism and to negate the influence of Arthur Griffith and his dual monarchy programme. De Valera had valid fears. On the first count for McGuinness, the Irish Parliamentary Party candidate Patrick McKenna was declared elected. However, as Pierce Beasley put it, a bundle of uncounted votes was then discovered and McGuinness won by 37 votes. This got the attention of British Prime Minister Lloyd George, who chose to set up a convention, possibly as a way of buying time. During the election, Collins had attended the Greville Arms Hotel, where he met the Kiernan girls. Collins was interested in Helen Kiernan, who was due to be married to another. Kitty Kiernan was seeing Harry Boland, while Thomas Ashe was interested in Maud Kiernan. On 15th June 1917, Bonar Law announced that the remainder of the prisoners still in England will be released unconditionally. De Valera and other prisoners were going home. On July 1917, De Valera insisted Owen McNeill, the man who had tried to scupper the plans for the rising with his countermanding order, should be on his election platforms, therefore ensuring support from Gaelic League intellectuals. Collins did not get involved in De Valera's Clare campaign. The East Clare by-election followed the death of the incumbent MP Willie Redmond of the Irish Parliamentary Party, who was killed in action in the First World War. The seat had been held since its creation in 1885 by constitutional nationalist MPs, and Redmond had been unopposed in every election since 1900. Willie was the brother of John Redmond of the Irish Parliamentary Party. The election was hotly contested between Eamon de Valera, the Sinn Féin candidate, and Patrick Lynch of the Irish Parliamentary Party. De Valera's victory by a huge margin was a massive show of support for Sinn Féin and the Republican movement nationally. It also did untold damage to the Irish Parliamentary Party. His victory in 1917 catapulted him onto the national stage. On August 18, 1917, Collins arrived in Carrick-on-Shannon to set up branches of Sinn Féin in Leitrim and Roscommon. Also in August, the Defence Against the Realm Act led to the arrest of Sinn Féiners such as Thomas Ashe, Austin Stack and Fionn Lynch for seditious speeches. They went on hunger strike as they wished for prisoner of war status.
By memory inspired and by love of country fired, the deeds thoughts of men I love to dwell upon, and the patriotic glow of my spirit must bestow a tribute to the men that are gone, boys gone. Here's a memory to the men that are gone.
The death of Thomas Ashe stirred Ireland. Thomas Ashe was to be given a public and military funeral by the Irish Volunteers. About 30,000 people attended his lying in state in the Mater Hospital.
And said about Thomas Ashe's funeral, says you've turned 100,000 constitutional nationalists into 100,000 Republicans. He gave the oration at Thomas Ashe's funeral.
And Michael Collins, in a volunteer uniform, spoke a few words beside the grave. He said, "Nothing additional remains to be said. That volley which we have just heard is the only speech which it is proper to make above the grave of a dead Fenian." Thomas Ashe was 32 when he died.
Well, you know, Arthur Griffith, you know, was the founder of Sinn Féin in 1905. He also wrote the book on the resurrection of Hungary, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and that's where he wanted to base Ireland on.
Sinn Féin had been used as a vehicle for the advancement of the Republic. A bitter clash occurred between those original members who backed Arthur Griffith's concept of an Anglo-Irish dual monarchy and the new members under Eamon de Valera who wanted to achieve a republic. Matters almost led to a split at the party's Ardfesh conference in October of 1917. Collins, who had supported de Valera, was appointed Director of Organisation. De Valera toured the country as a paid national organiser for Sinn Féin. He called on the people to repudiate the so-called Irish Convention then sitting. He also hoped that President Woodrow Wilson's announced war aims would lead to Irish freedom. The Allies during World War I supposedly were fighting for the rights of small nations, and de Valera challenged them to name those countries. Once proof had been given that Ireland would be included among those nations, de Valera promised that 500,000 Irishmen would be prepared to help the Allies. De Valera's logic was, if Britain were to ignore Ireland's right to self-determination after World War I, it would be possible to call on the great bulk of the Irish in the United States to use their weighty influence to put pressure on the British. On the 8th of October, Michael Collins went back to speak in Ballinolea. Local police had warned that since the speech for which Ashe had been arrested had been made there, speeches of a strong, seditious nature could be expected. In Collins' speech on Ashe, he denounced the local police for lying at his court-martial. "Thomas Ashe is not dead," he declared. "His spirit is still with us." He also said of the British government and concessions that you will not get anything from the British government unless you approach them with a bullock's tail in one hand and a landlord's head in the other. De Valera was a former member of the IRB and suspected Collins of organising more than volunteers and to curse all secret societies. A united front in public, but in private, cracks were emerging.
You know, he was a very playful man, you know, and he had a massive character. I mean, he was called the big fella, 5'10". He was called the big fella, but he was only 5'10". So, I mean, it wasn't too big in stature, so I think that was more to do. That was more to do with his character. He was a very learned man. You know, he was very, very into his plays.
But he was very, very well educated, and it shows up throughout his life.
I mean, I think by his own words, he never missed a Shaw play when he was in London.
George Bernard Shaw, in a letter to Collins' sister Hanny, August 25th, 1922, 3 days after his death. "My dear Miss Collins, don't let them make you miserable about it. How could a born soldier die better than at the victorious end of a good fight? Falling to the shot of another Irishman, a damned fool, but all the same an Irishman who thought he was fighting for Ireland. A Roman to Roman? I met Michael for the first and last time on Saturday last, and I'm very glad I did.
I rejoice in his memory, and will not be so disloyal to it as to snivel over his valiant death. So tear up your mourning, and hang up your brightest colours in his honour. And let us all praise God that he did not die in the snuffy bed of a trumpery cough, weakened by age, and saddened by the disappointments that would have attended his work had he lived.
And also J.M. Barrie wrote to the family as well. You know,
Peter Pan?
Yeah, he wrote to the family as well. We actually had his letters.
The grave has been, the flowers have been tended, the Glasnevin Cemetery tend the area, and that it's, and the flowers are tended by Collins 22 Society.
Okay.
James, Ronnie, Paul, Rod Dennison. It's just our love for him. He was, to me, he was a fantastic person in the way he achieved things, in the way he managed, and especially the way he managed having people doing and putting people into jobs where he knew he could get 100% out of them. We've great things here as well, Marcus. We come down here, the very strange things we find on the grave. A lot of money on the grave.
Really?
Yeah, a lot of coins on the grave. It is a soldier's thing, but it's also a Greek thing of paying the ferryman.
Okay.
Leaving a coin to pay the ferryman.
Yeah.
But the amount of ashes that we find on the grave. People leaving a little bit of ashes, their family's ashes on the grave.
Wow.
You'll always move the stones. Now, as soon as we see it now, we never touch it, we just leave them there.
Yeah.
But you see them, it's like a grey black powder on the thing, and it's just people leaving a little bit of their family's ashes on. We see that every week.
To me, personally, I think he's one of the greatest Irishmen that ever lived. I think he's a great, love him or hate him, from a history perspective, I think he's a great avenue, if you like, or gateway for young people that has an interest in history. Because through Michael Collins, for instance, you know, he was involved in the Rising. Of course, he was one of the guys who spearheaded the War of Independence. He was involved in the Civil War. His father, if you're looking at it from his family life, his father actually experienced the famine. So, you know, there's a gateway into that sort of element of Irish history. And he was also a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. So you're into the Fenians there straight away. This is Valerie Dillon.
Yeah.
And her mother, Mrs. Dillon, was here before. I used to sell the flowers here at the gate of Glasnevin Cemetery. Valerie does it nowadays. Fifth generation. And we always have bought our flowers off the Dillon family since we started taking care of the flowers on Michael Collins' grave.
How do you think he should be remembered?
I think he should be remembered as a man, a human being.
Yeah.
It's true enough that some people who admire him so much tended to idolize him, and it doesn't do him any good. I mean, he had his flaws.
I've got every book that was ever written on Collins.
Why? What's the passion?
Total fascination with the man. All the wonderful good parts and looking for the bad parts, which I couldn't find many anyway. Yeah. But probably the greatest Irishman that ever lived.
The demythologized Michael Collins is well caught by Rex Taylor.
Okay.
Yeah, who was, as you know, he was English and sought from a different prison, but very well. The real Michael Collins was a man with work to do, fastidious, methodical go-getter, and exacting, sometimes tyrannical taskmaster to those who worked under him. And Taylor says this, the most lethal weapon he carried was a fountain pen. He was a brilliant organiser and a born administrator and a man with work to do. He was the initial force behind the Constitution of 1922. He told the committee that they were not to be bound by legal formalities and were to put a constitution of a free state. Michael Collins, in his book To Freedom, the ideal is not good unless it lights our present path. And again, the Ireland to which we are true, to which we are devoted and faithful, is the ideal, which means there is always something more to strive for.
He was very often described as a bully and abrasive, but demanding and brilliant. He was methodical, he was arrogant, but charmingly charismatic. He was inconsiderate, but he was very caring and thoughtful. He was a man who calculatedly killed many, many others, but on the other hand, he was a laughing boy. He was exuberant, but he was maudlin. He was idealistic, but he was pragmatic. He was generous and loyal. He was a hero to suit the times. Now, all of us are very, very complex, but if you just take a look at some of those traits, they're very difficult to reconcile with some of the others. This was a man that I'm not sure anyone even then knew him extremely well. One thing that many, many people said was that in all things Michael had to win.